In the old days, the newspapers were a spotlight in a room that was dark. You couldn't see what was going on, and the newspaper illuminated the truth. There was a scarcity problem. In the future, the problem is abundance. It's a crowded, noisy room, and you don't know what's true and what's not. You can't find the truth amongst all this information. And so I think the newspaper will again be a spotlight in a world of abundance where we can hopefully highlight what is real and what is true, and that people will put a value on that, just like they did when there wasn't any information. They'll put a value on it when they understand there's too much and oftentimes inaccurate information. That's my hope. Does the world come around? I don't know.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is the president and publisher of the Anchorage Daily News, Ryan Binkley. Ryan is the oldest son of former state Senator John Binkley. And when John decided to run for governor in 2006, Ryan, at the age of 27, took over the Binkley family tourism business based in Fairbanks. That business today includes the Riverboat Discovery, a gold mining tour, and a partnership with a sightseeing company in Southeast Alaska. It was in 2017 that Ryan and his three younger siblings purchased the Anchorage Daily News, the state's largest newspaper. Ryan is on the show to talk about the media landscape in Alaska, the ADN's place in it, and the future of both Alaska media and the ADN. Ryan Binkley, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
I was born in Fairbanks. That's where I live today. And I grew up all over the state. When I was first born, we lived here. And then when I was really young, first couple of years of life, we moved out to Bethel, Alaska. My folks had a tug and barge business out there in the late 70s. My dad hauled gravel and construction supplies and people and all manner of things, equipment all over the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta, based out of Bethel, mostly on the Kuskokwim River, but also on the Yukon River. And so we lived out there in my early years. I started going to school out there. And then in the mid-'80s, he decided to join the legislature and ran for House first and then Senate, representing that area. And first we commuted back and forth part of the year in Bethel, part of the year in Juneau, and then eventually moved to Juneau full-time so that we could be more stable in the school year. And then I lived in Juneau for many years. And then when I was in junior high, we moved the family back to Fairbanks. My dad left the legislature. I spent the rest of my time growing up in Fairbanks and then left for a number of years for school and other things, came back in the early 2000s.
Hey, I want to pause because that's unusual. I know of people who will do the half and half thing where they'll move their kids to Juneau for half the year. But it seems to be more popular for folks to leave their kids back in their home community. But you guys made your permanent school year Juneau. So you did fall and spring semesters in Juneau.
Yeah, we did.
And your dad just went back to Bethel to represent his home. I mean, yeah, how did that work?
I'm trying to remember. It was when he was in the Senate. So for the first couple of years in the House, we did the back and forth thing, as I recall. And I think mostly then we were mostly in Bethel. I don't recall that we actually moved to Juneau then. And then when he won for the Senate, we did. And I don't remember how it worked exactly. I was very young. We were going back and forth some, but again, we were at school in Juneau. And don't forget that district was different. It was an interior district. It went all the way to the Canadian border and followed the Yukon River out across the middle of Alaska to the Kuskokwim Delta. And so it wasn't like one district like Anchorage, really, for example. I mean, Bethel, even being in Bethel, was being away from your district at that time. There were over 70 communities that he represented, most of them not on the road system.
Wow.
And so he would visit most of them once a year. You know, he flew, he was a pilot. And so he would fly around and check in on all the places. But it's a different model of representation there because those communities are so small and so spread out and so isolated that it's not like, Anchorage, where you can see your whole community or your whole district in a couple hours.
So what year did you graduate from high school?
96.
And you graduated from which high school?
West Valley High School in Fairbanks.
And then what happened?
Went to college. I went to Colorado to a small engineering school to earn a petroleum engineering degree and planned to go into the oil business. I had worked in our family business ever since I was a little kid in Fairbanks in tourism and didn't know if it was for me, wanted to go see the world. I was really interested in engineering, loved petroleum engineering. It's a really unique practice within. Engineering is a unique science amongst the applied sciences, and petroleum is a particularly unique type of engineering, and I just loved it. And I had a great time in Colorado. After that, I did some sort of summertime internship jobs in the oil industry and realized that while I loved the work, I really hated working in a big company. I worked for Arco in Anchorage downtown, and it was a great company, great people, but I couldn't stand having to wear a button-up shirt and go in at a certain time every day. And I had grown up in the family business where you had responsibility early and you had control over things, you had autonomy. And so I wasn't a match for corporate America. So I realized that after college and didn't know what I wanted to do. I spent 3 winters skiing in Colorado full-time and working back in the family business in the summers. And then in the early 2000s, decided to join the business full-time and came back, moved to Fairbanks, built a house, got married, and started my career in tourism.
Well, okay. So you came back to work for a family business in Fairbanks. Can you get us from there to the decision to purchase the ADN?
Sure. It's not a decision that we sought out. It's not something we went after, and it wasn't on anybody's vision board to go buy the ADN. I took over in kind of a middle management position in our family business, working in operations, overseeing a lot of the boat operations, the marine operations, and that crew, that staff, hiring, and all those things. Kind of learned the business. Then in 2006, my dad, who was president at the time, decided he was going to run for governor against Frank Murkowski and the then somewhat unknown mayor of a small town called Wasilla, and of course that political history that everybody's aware of. But he, in December of 2005, came in and said, I'm going to run for governor. It's going to be a full-time job, and I'm out of here. And everyone took a look around and said, who's up next? And I was 27, I think, or something like that. And they said, okay, Ryan, you're the president of the company. So I took over in the beginning of 2006. And how
many employees are there of the company?
Oh, then we probably had 170, maybe summertime, seasonal. Yeah. And then in the winter, we were down to 30 or so. And about the same now.
Got it.
But in a family business, I say take over, I don't know if you ever really take over in a family business. My uncles are still involved, my siblings. So it's still very much a family affair, very much a team effort. Ran the company for a number of years, and we started looking to branch out at a certain point in the teens, realizing that tourism was growing in the state for sure, but it was growing a little slower in the interior. Other areas had other things going on. So we started to look around at other potential opportunities in tourism. And we've grown the tourism business outside of Fairbanks. We are investors in a flight scene company in Girdwood. We own a flight scene company in Juneau and then the Ketchikan operation. So we've grown the tourism business around the state. As we were doing that, my dad got a call one day out of the blue from a man in Michigan, I believe, and he was looking to purchase the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. It had been put up for sale. Its owner was ill and desired to sell it. And for whatever reason, this man from the Midwest was thinking about buying the paper in Fairbanks, Alaska. Didn't know anybody in Alaska at all, but he knew a friend who knew a guy who raced from Alaska, who raced snow machines in Michigan and in the 70s, and that was my dad. So he got this number from a friend, called my dad out of the blue and said, I'm thinking of coming to Fairbanks to look at this business. I just want to know what kind of community it is, how big is it? What is the economy like? Blah, blah, blah. They got talking, got to be friends, came up, stayed with us, and he, was investigating buying the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. One of his challenges was didn't have any local connections. And so we ended up first partnering with him on a bid to buy the News Miner, and then he decided in the end he wasn't interested, and then we made our own bid to buy the News Miner. It was in the course of meeting him and kind of investigating it that we realized what a unique and interesting business the newspaper business was, and got interested in its role in the community, what it means in a community, and as a way to help bolster the Fairbanks economy, the Fairbanks community by maintaining a strong and healthy newspaper. Ended up not buying it. It was bought by the Sten Foundation, and they're good owners, and that's just fine. But through the course of that, we met Alice Rogoff, who, of course, owned the ADN. That was in late 2016 and early 2017 when that process happened. Met Alice, flew to Anchorage, and sat down with her in, I think, like March or April of 2017. And she said she was looking for partners. She needed help with the paper. She had it for, I think, 2.5 years at that point. She, of course, had her own dispatch for a while. They bought ADN. It was going okay, we gathered, but she wanted local investors. She wanted some help. The business was changing fast. I think she was, going in a million different directions at the same time. And we walked out of that meeting thinking, well, that was interesting. We weren't really interested in partnering with her necessarily, but we said, if you're ever interested in selling the paper, let us know. And she called us back in a couple of weeks and said, I might be interested in selling the paper. And so we got talking, and we started talking about what that could look like, started taking a look at the finances, and we realized really quickly what a financial mess this company was in, what a hole it had been in.
I want to pause and ask a couple of follow-up questions and then come back to Alice Rogoff.
Sure.
When your dad ran for governor in 2006 and you took over the family business, he lost the primary. So why didn't he just come back and take over?
I think at that point, a couple of things. One, in the same election, the state passed for the first time a head tax on cruise visitors. Right. And of course, we work very closely with the cruise lines. And so there was an opportunity. I think the cruise lines realized that they hadn't done a good job of telling their story in the state of Alaska. And so they were looking around and looking for somebody to represent them in the state, in the communities. And so they tapped him on the shoulder and asked him, would you be interested in leading an effort for us, on behalf of the cruise industry in Alaska? And he said that he was.
Did he become like a lobbyist for them? Or
no, he stood up what was called CLIA. It was called the Alaska Cruise Association first, ACA, and then CLIA. They hired lobbyists, but they were the local representation, the PR, boots on the ground guys for the cruise industry writ large in Alaska. But after it's a bruising battle to go through a gubernatorial primary, particularly that one with Frank Rokowski on one side and Sarah Palin on the other. And so he decompressed for a while and came back. And at that point, I was kind of entrenched in the business. I'd taken over, and he would have had to kick me out of my seat. And I think at that point, he didn't want to do that. And so he had this opportunity with the cruise lines, and so he decided to take that.
How many brothers and sisters do you have?
There are 4 in my family, 2 brothers and a sister, plus me. And there are 8 in my generation amongst us and our cousins. And we're all owners of the business. And many of us work in the business, not all, but a bunch of us do.
Was everyone comfortable with you taking over?
I'm the oldest. And so I was the only one in my generation in the business at the time.
And you were 27 and they were younger. So like having a 22-year-old take over probably didn't.
Yeah, my brother had just come back into the company, I think, at the time, and he would have been in his early 20s then. And it was, in hindsight, too early for me. At 27, it would have been even tougher for one of them, I think. But it was really just an accident of timing.
Got it. One more question about growing up with a politician dad. Did you grow up feeling like you were aligned with your dad politically? I mean, did you ever, or did you not even think about it? As a parent, my child hates politics and, really bristles, very annoyed with me doing meetings and Zooms and taking him places. And I don't know what your feeling was about having a politician dad and participating in stuff in Juneau or back in your home district or going to events.
I don't know that anyone's ever asked me that before. It's an interesting question. It makes me realize how sort of strange my childhood probably was between growing up in a family business on one hand and then being involved in politics on the other. And I remember being similarly annoyed many times just being bored a lot. There was obviously no iPhones or internet. And so I just remember lots of time spent sitting in offices and waiting rooms, waiting for him to finish work or get out of meetings and things like that. But also the legislature, I don't know if you feel this being from Anchorage, I'd be curious to hear if you do. It's almost like this insular world that it's like the military almost. If you're outside, you have no idea what it's like on the inside. And when you're inside, it's like it's your whole life. All your friends are in the legislature. Everybody you know is there in that building. It's probably like living in Whittier or something. Like everything happens there. I felt like I was part of that community. I knew everybody. I walked around the Capitol building. I had a job. My first job outside the family business was all of the interior legislators had a candy dish on their desk, and my job was to go around and refill it once a week. And so I had a big bag of butterscotch candies, and I'd go around for a couple of hours once a week. And on my own, I was probably 8 or 9 and refill these candy dishes. And I would meet people, talk to adults, talk to legislators. It didn't seem weird to me. So, I felt sort of like I was part of that world. And it was very natural for me to have a conversation, not about politics, but with an adult walking around the Capitol. But I would also say, maybe this is me just looking back with rose-colored glasses. I was very young. But I think I can say this, that it wasn't as polarized back then as it is today. I mean, the pipeline was only 10 years old. My dad came from a rural Alaska district. He was a Republican from Western Alaska, very rare. And so he was the kind of Republican that had to work across party lines a lot on a lot of different issues. And so I don't even remember knowing who was a Republican and who was a Democrat, if I'm honest, partly because of my age and partly because I don't think it mattered quite as much then as it does today.
My dad had 5 kids, and I can say safely that a couple of his kids align perfectly with my father's political views, and a couple of his kids absolutely align the opposite of his views. Do you feel like you guys all align with your dad?
I think, number one, we're all very opinionated and we all have positions. They often diverge, but not in a big way. I think directionally, we're all aligned. I would say for me, my dad was a Republican. Obviously, he was involved in Republican Party politics. So I grew up thinking I was a Republican. When I was 18, I registered to vote for the first time. I put down Republican. I don't know if I would do the same today. I probably wouldn't. I'd probably be independent or undecided or undeclared. I think my dad and I probably agree on 90% of things. We diverge here and there. And I'd say the same for my siblings probably, but we're all in the same direction. We're all, I would say, entrepreneurs. We're all small business people. We're all for free markets and for limited government. How we get there and some of the specifics on certain things we may diverge on, but I think we're all fairly well aligned. And for me, it was really later in college, towards the end of my college time, when I really got interested in policy, in issues, in politics, in the great questions of life, like anybody does when they're in college. That's the whole fun part of college, is to start tackling the big questions of life. And I tried to forge my own unique philosophies and identities around things like that.
So now let's go back to Alice Rogoff. So you were in the meeting with her when she was looking for partners, and you guys said, we're not interested in partnering, but we would be interested in possibly purchasing the paper. Had you guys gone into the meeting planning on making that offer or making that suggestion? Or
that was before we knew any of the finances or any of that. We had taken a look under the hood yet and seen what was really there. We just felt like the news at that point, and still, I guess today, feel the newspaper is such an integral part of a healthy city, a healthy state. I remember when I was a kid, my grandfather telling me about how important banks were, how important local community banks are to an economy. I had no idea what he was talking about. And he said the same thing about newspapers, how important newspapers are to a city. And that always stuck with me. And we thought that if she was really, truly interested in getting rid of it, it would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And we've been here for generations, going to be here for generations. And of course, that was before we took a look at the finances. So we said, yeah, we could be interested. And then she called us back a little while later and said, I'd be interested in selling. And so we came in and then started to take a look. And as I said before, saw the real problems they had.
it's kind of like buying a vehicle. Like you see a car that you like and you want to buy it, and then you look under the hood and you find all these problems and you're like, you know what, maybe I should buy a different vehicle. You guys made this casual offer to purchase a paper without looking under the hood. And then when you looked under the hood, you saw a lot of concerning issues. And I want to talk about that because I didn't know a lot about this, but I've learned a lot from doing this series of interviews on the media in Alaska, that McClatchy had owned the paper. Patrick Daugherty said McClatchy had owned the paper. McClatchy had poured... Patrick Daugherty said that poured in over $100 million. $100 million basically lost over the course of a decade when they first bought the paper, basically having that newspaper war with the Anchorage Times, and then a brief period of being in the black, and then things starting to head in the wrong direction, and then being offered this inflated price by Alice Rogoff to purchase the paper from McClatchy. And then she had the paper, and then talking to folks who worked there, like Nat Hers, saying that there were so many awesome opportunities that came up because Alice Rogoff was like pouring a lot of money in, and they were sending reporters to do really interesting projects and funding those interesting projects, I guess, really just thanks to her wealth, because it certainly wasn't being paid for by the subscribers or by the ads that were being sold. And in comes your family to purchase that paper. Can you speak to any of that history and how you guys strategized what you were going to do with the paper?
Yeah, I would say I would push back on a little bit of that. I don't know that all that's quite true. I think that idea of what McClatchy lost during the war with the Times is overstated. I don't think it was like it was.
I think it was $100 million.
No, I don't. Not at all. I think it was losses, but I don't think it was anything to the depth of that. And I think there was the years between when the ADN and the Times merged and the ADN sold to Alice Rogoff were incredibly lucrative. Incredibly lucrative. That was the golden age of newspapering, and 40% margins sometimes for years.
According to Pat, it was very good until enter Craigslist. Maybe you can give some perspective on that. Like his perspective was like the cash engine of the paper was the classified section. And once Craigslist kind of became ubiquitous, that the classifieds were no longer a cash engine for a newspaper, that was an enormous loss.
It was a loss, but it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a financial cliff that company fell upon, or any printing newspaper for that matter. And it wasn't necessarily just Craigslist. Craigslist slowly eroded one revenue stream, and classifieds were a unique revenue stream in that they're a very high margin. Now, how much did they contribute to the gross revenue picture? It would have been a minority of the gross revenue, but a lot of it fell to the bottom line, no question about it. It was incredibly lucrative, but it wasn't, and by any means, what propped up the newspaper business writ large in the late 90s or early 2000s. I would say, if you want to point to the one disruption for newspapers, don't point to Craigslist, point to the internet in general. Craigslist was one outgrowth, and the decentralization of peer-to-peer marketplaces, if you want to say that's what Craigslist was. Also the decentralization of advertising, the decentralization of attention and eyeballs, all of the platforms that facilitated that, like Facebook and Google and of course MySpace and others back in the days. You can't really point to one specific platform or one specific service. It was a combination of all these things facilitated by the internet. And the industry was just quite simply too slow to respond. And there was a lot of legacy thinking. There were a lot of multi-generational family businesses that just knew how to do one thing. And they're still making saddles, and Henry Ford is building the Model T, and the world is changing, and the industry couldn't adapt fast enough. That's really, I think, what happened. Eventually preprints would go away. Eventually advertising would move online. There was just it was a death by a bunch of cuts, not just classifieds.
That's an important perspective, because that means that your family was able to see the potential for having a profitable newspaper, a newspaper that paid for itself and that generated a profit. Because I think from the conversations that I've had recently, there is a very doom and gloom feeling that newspapers in general are dying, and that people shouldn't expect to make a profit. It's like more like a public utility that needs to be invested in because it needs to be there, but it's not necessarily something that's going to generate money for shareholders.
I think that's partly true. If you're asking what we knew at the time, that's very much different than what I know today. If you want to talk about what I know today, I think that is very much true. It's not that the newspaper can't generate profits. It can. Ours does. We've chosen to reinvest all of those profits back into the business to keep it sustainable, so it doesn't throw off free cash flow necessarily like another business might. It could if we didn't feel strongly about wanting to continue to reinvest this for the long term. So it's more of a long-term strategy for us. But it's just much harder than it was. In the 80s and 90s, when Pat Doherty was in the paper business, it was very easy to make a lot of money in the business. It was like anybody could make great money. Now it's not. It's very, very hard. You have to do things that are difficult. You have to make really hard decisions. You have to basically decide, no matter what, we're going to keep this thing going, whatever it takes. And so for us, I think coming to it without all of the history baked in, all of the prior knowledge, understanding of the industry, was actually an advantage, because we could look at it with learner's eyes freshly and just look at this as a business and say, here's what the P&L is, here's what our revenue is. We got to make $1 more than we spend every year, or we're out of business. And so that's what we're going to do. And so that's what we've done. And we've kind of taken I would say maybe it's a cold look at it, but it's what's needed to keep us in business. And it wasn't being done, and that's what led it into bankruptcy. And so taking a sort of calculated, dispassionate view of it as a business that needs to survive has helped us make some really hard decisions. And we've had to make some really hard decisions. That's not easy, to shrink the size of a staff, to tell people.
Because you immediately laid off a third of the folks working there.
Yeah, within the first month or so. The ADN, this has been reported publicly during the bankruptcy. I've said it a number of times. In the first half of 2017, the Anchorage Daily News lost $4 million in operating revenue, negative $4 million operating revenue. It annualized, it was an $8 million loss run rate. They had also made investments, multi-million-dollar investments in a new press facility and others that they ended up walking away from. When we talk about losses, they were massive. I mean, they outpaced even Alice Rogoff's ability to finance them. So the business was well beyond life support. It was dead. And so to come in and make it viable, we had to do some really tough things in order to make it viable, and included laying off about a third. We would then go on to have another round of layoffs later. I don't remember exactly when, maybe 6 months later, and then continue to shrink it through natural attrition since then. So we've continually had to downsize over the years.
You decided to keep David Hewlin on as the editor. I mean, was that a no-brainer, or did you guys think a lot about that, or how was that decided?
We thought a lot about it, but it was the obvious choice. We wouldn't have, when there was a decision point, I forget when it was, it would have been sometime in September of 2017, where we had to decide, are we doing this or not? Like we had to basically at some point just go all in on this. And we would never have done it if it wasn't for David and Roger Weinfurter and Ken Carter and Kia Charisma and some other really talented folks who were in that building at the time. I didn't know anything about newspapers. What do I know about how to run a newspaper? But I knew that the people in that building had the answers. My job was to make some tough decisions and give them the resources they need. And David was one of them. I had a lot of confidence in. I'm so glad that I did, because keeping David on was one of the best decisions we made. He's a professional, longtime editor, lifetime newspaperman. He's got impeccable judgment and taste. And I knew that he could continue to run that newsroom. And two things about David that I think were unique that really made us confident in his ability to adapt was, one, for a lifetime newspaper guy, David has no nostalgia for things. He's very black and white in terms of the world is changing and we need to be able to adapt just as fast as the world is in order to survive. There are no sacred cows in that newsroom because of him. That's something that's very rare, I've learned, in this business, and it's a tremendous attribute.
So you mentioned that you didn't know a lot about the newspaper business. You mainly knew more about business. So you felt like your job was basically to just take this business that's massively in the red and bring them out of the red. And you understood, well, here's where we have to cut these costs. And so it was a pretty, I guess, more like a mathematical exercise and less of like, this is what I want my newspaper to look like.
Oh, yeah. In terms of this is what I want my newspaper to look like, I don't even know that I get involved in that so much today, if you're talking about the news coverage.
Well, I guess the question is, it stems from this fear that folks had. And I think I brought this up in the Tom Hewitt interview, a fear that when you guys took over with this long Republican pedigree behind you, that the paper would take a right turn. You maintained David Hewlin. There wasn't that feared right turn. And I think that was reassuring for folks. But I guess, especially with President Trump being elected in 2016 and the sort of demonization of the media in general, particularly the legacy media, that there might be more editorial decisions made to sort of assuage folks on the right who believe that the ADN is a left-wing media organization.
Yeah, that was something that people assumed right from the jump. They assumed, because of my family's long-time involvement in party politics, that this was an attempt to buy the paper for just the reason that you said. And it wasn't. That's not why we did it. People on both sides of the aisle assumed that was the case. I think, to your point, half of them were gratified that it wasn't the case, and the other half are mad that it wasn't the case because they wanted it to be that. I didn't buy it to put my thumb on the scale and try and push the coverage in one direction or the other. I bought it because I believe that it's important that we have it. I believe that it's a good newspaper then. I believe it's a good newspaper now. And to be a great state, the state and the city of Anchorage need a good, strong, healthy newspaper. So it was much more to ensure its survival because of its import than it was to try and push it in one direction or another. Now, I'm the owner of the company. I'm the publisher of the paper. If I felt like at some point the paper was veering too far in one or other direction, I may get involved. But I have not had to do that since I've been involved, and I would be loath to have to do that. I wouldn't. It's not really my job as the owner to go in and push the coverage.
But you're not just the owner anymore. You're the publisher. was my Google this morning about what the newspaper publisher does. A newspaper publisher is responsible for the overall operation and success of a newspaper, including overseeing both the editorial and business aspects. And then it goes on to say that publishers to varying degrees suggest story ideas and review content. Ultimately, quoting from Wikipedia, the publisher is the leader of the organization, responsible for its long-term vision and success. And at the time that Andy Pennington stepped down, there was a quote in your paper that if there was one single person who we can point to who dragged this company out of bankruptcy, it's Andy. It's not hyperbole to say that we wouldn't be at all here doing this work today if it wasn't for him. So I feel like you're stepping into his role now in 2025, which to me, at least from this definition, and I guess publishers vary from place to place and publication to publication, but that you would have much more say in the paper's content than you have in the past.
Yeah, it's just not the way our company's set up. I suppose every paper is probably different. The publisher is really like the president of the company. It's just a code word. It doesn't mean anything different than that. And there's a million decisions outside the newsroom that need to be made because of the unique nature of the news business and the need for credibility and objectivity. And look, by the way, I'm going to make these statements. We're all human. We all make mistakes at times. We all have egos and we all have emotions. So I'm not going to say that we're not infallible. But generally, we do try to maintain a pretty strict firewall between the coverage decisions and the business decisions. And that's where the distinction lies. The editor makes the coverage decisions. I think that the strongest papers in the country maintain that strict break. The publisher makes the business decisions. Oftentimes, those two may coincide or conflate. For example, right now, we're hiring a bunch of positions. I'm sure you want to get into the state of the newsroom. And so we're making decisions around, what kind of coverage areas can we fill and who can we get and what the candidates look like. And so I'm involved in some of those decisions, but mostly as an advisory role, not really as the prime decision maker, because in that case, some sort of the business coincides with the strategy of the newsroom. But I'm not involved at all in what stories are being written and how they're being edited or written. I have nothing to do with any of that.
When you think about expanding the audience, do you feel like your subscribership is all that it could be? Or do you think you could get more subscribers by appealing to more folks? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure those are conversations that you guys have.
No, we don't have conversations about could we make more money if we were more politically aligned one direction or the other. It's not a conversation that I've ever been a part of.
That's not really what I was asking. For example, and this is on the record, Kevin McCabe, the representative from Big Lake, has said he has to publish his editorials in Must Read Alaska because the ADN won't publish him. Tom Hewitt has said that's simply not true, that when he was editing the opinions page, actually wanted more conservatives to submit opinion pieces, but that they just weren't submitting them. And so if it looks like there's an overrepresentation of the liberal perspective in the opinion pages, it's because, well, I had more people submitting their letters to the editor, reflecting that particular political affiliation. And that it wasn't any sort of effort on his part to not publish conservative perspectives. And I think the problem with that is that, that kind of feeds fuel to the fire for those on the right who say that the ADN is a liberal paper. And so I guess, in a way, could you appeal more to them by actively soliciting more commentary from them to reflect their viewpoint more consistently so that it's not as easy for someone like Representative McCabe to say the ADN is a left-wing newspaper?
Sure. Let's just be super clear. Everything I've been saying so far has been vis-a-vis the news coverage. And that's a big different arena than the opinion side of things. And the opinion is a sandbox that I do play in, just to be totally clear. That is a place where the publisher or the owner injects his political philosophy, ideas, opinions, blah, blah, blah. So we don't make any secret about that. That's written on the opinion page. My name is printed there every day. That should be clear. And I think that's what Kevin McCabe was talking about, was his opinion pieces. Now, in the opinion section, I think you're right. And I think anybody who says that the left perspective is a bit overrepresented there, I'd have a hard time disagreeing with that, exactly for the reason Tom talked about. And Tom and I talked about that a bunch of times over the years. How can we try and get more engagement from the right in this opinion page? Our whole goal of the opinion page is for it to be a town square. Truly, that might sound trite, but that's honestly our only goal. And we inject our own opinion, by the way. And by the way, if you disagree with us, we'll print that too. And if you think we're out to lunch, we've printed many times when people have said the ADN doesn't know what it's talking about. We've printed Kevin McCabe when he's made his submissions. And other right-wing politicians have made claims like that all the time, that they weren't allowed to come see us, or that they sent something in and we never printed it. And at any time somebody's brought that up to me, I've gone to Tom, we've searched our email, no sign of it. I think it's a really convenient boogeyman that can be red meat for a person's base to hold the ADN opinion section up as a foil, as the bad guy. It's simply not the case. I can just tell you, all I can tell you is the truth being inside that will print anybody's pieces as long as they pass the basic tests of decorum and truthfulness. One way, when you talk about are we left, are we right, one way I can calibrate that is I'm the one that gets all the complaints. Like my email blows up daily with people who are not happy with our coverage. And people don't believe this. Nobody wants to believe this on either side. But we'll write a story and I'll get banged on it from the left and I'll get banged on from the right because of the same story. Same words, same article, same everything. And one person will read it and think it's absolutely biased against them. And another person will read it and think it's absolutely biased against them on the opposite sides of the aisle.
Right. So you feel like you're doing it right when everybody's angry.
Yeah. I mean, I can kind of calibrate that way a little bit. If I'm getting complaints from both sides, whether it's on the opinion side or on the news side, it gives me a sense of I think at least we're being fair. Like, I understand you're not going to all like it, but I at least can, with confidence, say that we're being fair. It's actually, I should say, part of the job that's fun is sitting in this seat. I get to hear from everybody across all the different sectors of Alaska, and I get to learn about everybody's opinion and learn about policy. And once I got over the sensitivities of people complaining, and once I grew some calluses around people being unhappy with our coverage, I've actually found it fun to be able to engage with people and really see from a remove how people are reacting to the stuff that we're writing.
So when you guys first purchased the ADN in the next couple of years after, you guys also purchased a couple of other smaller newspapers like the Bristol Bay Times, the Arctic Sounder. I'm just curious about if that's a strategy going forward. Would you continue to purchase smaller newspapers around Alaska? Can you talk about that at all?
To answer your question directly, probably not. I've looked at probably all of them over the last 7 years, and I don't know that it would make sense. They're all struggling to varying degrees, I would say. ADN is lucky that we're right at the size where we still have enough scale to be able to be profitable, not throw off any cash, but at least keeping our head above water. I think when you get too much smaller than us, it becomes really, really tough. And I really feel for those communities, and I really tip my hat to those owners who continue to put those papers out because they believe in it and they believe in their communities. And oftentimes they're subsidizing that on behalf of their families in order to keep that going for their communities. Would it ever make sense for them to join forces with the ADN? I don't know if it makes sense for us to buy them and run them necessarily, but there are some efforts underfoot to potentially try and bolster them. There have been some conversations more lately about how can we share resources, how can we use ADN infrastructure to help prop some of them up or give them support. I don't know if those will bear fruit or not, but we're hopeful that if there's a role for ADN to help some of the smaller papers, we want to be able to help them, just because I want a healthy news ecosystem in the state of Alaska, and more reporters is better than less reporters.
Well, speaking of those smaller newspapers in rural Alaska, with the rescission of the federal funds for public broadcasting and what's very clear, the potential closing down of some of our public radio stations in rural Alaska. I just interviewed the person who's the director of the radio station in Valdez, and he said their radio station is about 70% federal funding. There's absolutely no way they're going to get donors who are going to make up for that 70% loss. There's no way the state of Alaska at this particular moment in time is going to make up for that loss. And he said that there are other radio stations that actually have a higher 80% or even 90% of their operating budget is federal money that they thought they were getting and they're not getting. What are your thoughts on the loss there? And if there's any way for the ADN to play a role in trying to make up for that loss?
Like I said, I'm for more reporters in general, and it's a big blow. It's part of a larger movement away from traditional media that newspapers were the first, but we're seeing the same thing in broadcast TV. Market forces, maybe that's not the specific stroke of a president's pen, but we're seeing this erosion of traditional media in every form, and we've been seeing it for a while. And I think we're going to continue to see it. And look, if there's a way for ADN to help bolster that reporting efforts in those communities, we're all for doing. We're fighting our own battles every day to stay in business. So it's not like we have a ton of bandwidth, but if there's things that we're doing that can be useful, we're up for it. I don't know what the long-term business model is for news in small communities. That's a really big question, and I have no idea. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 months, let alone the next 5 years. I don't know how it's going to work out. I do believe fundamentally the value proposition of pay me some money for the information, truthful, honest, objective information about what's going on in my town. I don't know that value proposition has changed so much. It's just that there have been substitutes for it. People are substituting what I would consider quality journalism for blogs or things they read on Facebook.
And you know why? Why do you think people are opting for blogs and social media posts as their primary source of news as opposed to the more reliable sources?
Well, I know in the past, there were just no options. There was TV, there was radio, and there was print. And so there was only one game in town. Or in that case, I suppose 3. Now there's a million. So there's a bunch of options and they're free. And I guess the ultimate question is, does each citizen put a value on the quality of the information they put in their brain? You could draw the analogy to, does each citizen put a value on the quality of food they put in their body? If there's free, very unhealthy food, a lot of people will choose it. And I'm not going to sit here and from an ivory tower and tell them that they should pay for this or that. Everyone makes their own decisions. We're all individuals and times are tough, and I get it. And quality news is expensive. So I would never wag my finger at them. But there's a reason Facebook has grown the way it has. It's a really convenient, well done service that is very useful for people. Is it a source of high quality news and information? I would say no, but it's a very useful tool for people. I don't know. I wish that people placed a higher value on our product, certainly. I do. That's why I got into the business. And I don't know, these things go in cycles. I don't know that it'll always be this way. Maybe this is being overly optimistic. I hope people more and more are waking up to the idea that sometimes this information can be manipulated. And there's a lot of scary things about AI's application in the news and about Russian troll farms and election interference on Facebook marketing and whatever else in the world. In the 80s, let's just say, or in the old days, the newspapers were a spotlight in a room that was dark. You couldn't see what was going on, and the newspaper illuminated the truth. There was a scarcity problem. In the future, the problem is abundance. It's a crowded, noisy room, and you don't know what's true and what's not. You can't find the truth amongst all this information. And so I think the newspaper will again be a spotlight in a world of abundance where we can hopefully highlight what is real and what is true, and that people will put a value on that, just like they did when there wasn't any information. They'll put a value on it when they understand there's too much and oftentimes inaccurate information. That's my hope. Does the world come around? I don't know.
I asked Nat Hers about the potential unforeseen consequence of less reporters and less media outlets in terms of not having a journalist reporting on committee meetings, on assembly working groups, on basically sort of like local things happening, because there was a study that came out that showed that when a community doesn't have a local news organization, they said that the corruption of the local government rose by 6.9%. Of course, that was based on number of cases of like prosecutions of things happening. They estimate that it might be much higher because they're not being caught. If no one's watching, they're not being caught. If no one's watching, then bad actors are going to behave more badly. And that really there is a change in the whole ecosphere when journalists are present and doing their jobs, even if we can't quantify it because there's no story. If they didn't do anything bad, there's no story written about something bad that didn't happen.
Yeah, you're talking about the intrinsic value to society of a free press. And I think that's something that we all probably learned about in school and would all agree with. But in the end, are we willing to pay for it? Look, there's no question. Just it's basic human nature. if someone's watching, you behave better. You do, I do, we all do. Their personal life, our professional lives. When police wear body cams, generally people behave better. When someone's watching you, you put your best foot forward. There's no question about it. And the press does that on behalf of the people, who can't be there to watch these things. And I think it's incredibly valuable. And I think we should have more of it. It's why we need more credible journalists and not less. And it's why I get up every morning and go to work to try and make sure that ADN is as healthy as we possibly can be, and that we don't lose any, that we already have lost, and that hopefully we're in a position at some point to start building back. I think you're perfectly illustrating the societal value of a free press. And that's a story, I'll tell you, Andrew, and I know you probably know this, there are thousands of those stories every day. I had no idea, being outside this business for many years, I assumed that reporters got up every day and they went and beat the streets and tried to shake the bushes to figure out what's going on. It's the opposite. It's a fire hose of information, and we have to ruthlessly prioritize what we put our resources to, because we don't have enough man hours to tell a bunch of stories that really need to be told and really should be told. Covering politics is just one aspect of it, and it's an important one. There are so many other coverage areas that we're not able to fully support the way that we should. There are thousands of stories that should be told that aren't every day because we don't have enough people to tell them. And journalists deserve to be paid well for the work they do, and they are underpaid, and they work really hard. And, we can't continue to expect them to personally subsidize this effort either. And
I wanted to talk about that because Tom Hewitt brought that up. Basically, everybody I've interviewed has brought it up, is that in the olden days of a journalist being able to support a family, do 38 years like David Hewlin or 34 years like Patrick Doherty, and buy a house and support their family. And what we see nowadays is a lot of young reporters working in Alaska. They do their job for a few years and then they graduate to a higher paying job, generally not as a journalist. And the specifics, my concern for even doing this report was Sean McGuire left the ADN, Tom Hewitt left, Emily Goody-Kuntz left, David Hewlin retired. And for me, that was like a little bit of a wake-up call, being like, who are we going to replace these people with? And the fear is they're going to be replaced by people who may not be from Alaska, might just be really young, and just maybe there's no way that they're going to instantly be able to replace those people who had all of this background knowledge in order to know what coming out of the fire hose is worth reporting on and what's not.
Yeah, I think it's a well-founded fear. The decision, there's no question we've had a lot of turnover in the newsroom of late. It's kind of a confluence, a perfect storm of circumstances, some of it financial, some of it not. Everybody's decision to leave has been different and unique and based on a lot of family situations and things that go beyond the finance. But also money makes a difference for all of us in our jobs. We all work for a paycheck, and that's a big part of it for any person, any family. There's no question about it. It's just all seemed to hit here at one time. Look, we will rebuild the newsroom. We're actively recruiting right now. We've got a couple of hires about to be announced, and there's a mix of experienced reporters that we're bringing in and new and young reporters as well. Some experience from out of state, some experience from in-state, some new to the field. It's kind of a mix. The reality is that we've all grew up in a world where for 20 or 30 years, for most of our news reading time, the salaries of the journalists were subsidized by the advertisers, the classifieds, the commercial print business, all the other revenue streams. Every part of the paper made money, and the newsroom lost a bunch of money. And there was enough money coming in that the papers could afford to pay a lot more for professional career journalists. And that money has gone away for the reasons we talked about before. And so it's just tougher now. And it really forces a bunch of hard decisions between mostly on Vicky, the editor, or David, and in the past, and me at some level, of where do we put our limited resources, because it's just very limited. And we do not want to go back into bankruptcy. Ultimately, the first rule of business is don't go out of business. And we did that once, and we're trying not to again. And so it forces us to make really tough decisions about, I want to go to that meeting, but there's 3 other meetings and I'm only one person and I got to cover this. And so we have to ruthlessly triage what we can cover.
We definitely have examples of journalists who came up to work a job at an Alaska newspaper and ended up staying for decades. So I don't want to bad mouth journalists moving from the lower 48 to Alaska, cover Alaska, because a lot of them really step up to the plate and make this their life's work. But I think there's a little bit of fear from folks that when you have journalists, and this happens all the time, and not just in newspapers, but in TV, lots of the media in Alaska, they'll say, oh, I just got here a month ago. What city did you just say? What acronym did you just use? Which, like, to somebody who's been in Alaska for longer than a year, they're going to know those acronyms. They're going to know those places. They're going to know what we're talking about. How do you get local journalists? How does Alaska grow its own journalists?
It's a big question. I don't have a good answer, but I think it's time we need to start talking about it. We need to somehow figure out a pipeline. Look, the economics are always going to make it difficult unless something changes in the business. And I hope that it will. And that would be a salve that would heal a lot of this if there was just more revenue coming in. But at a certain point, I think you're right. I think we need to develop a pipeline of talent. We've talked about it a little bit in our company about how we can do that. It would be a multi-year generational effort probably over time. I think people, though, have to look at this as a job that they want to do. It has to be exciting for a young person. And I think when you're young and idealistic and money matters less, you can do it. But to your point, and to Tom's point and others, it's harder when you're mid-career and want to have a family and your priorities change a little bit. Also, I should say, the money's not great, but it's also a job that is becoming tougher and tougher. Journalists were heroes in the 80s and 90s, and they're villains today from all sides. It's really a job that is thankless. It is the definition of a thankless job. And not only did these folks not get paid what they deserve, but they get beat down online. Now that so much of our discourse has moved online and become so, I don't know if toxic is too strong of a word, but just so difficult. It's really hard psychologically to be a reporter now. And burnout is becoming a real problem because you put your heart and soul into a piece, you craft a piece, you go learn a bunch, you try and retell a story in a way that people can understand it, and you put a piece of yourself in it, and you put it online, and it just gets bashed by everybody. And the governor stands there and holds it up at a press conference and tries to use it as a foil for his political goals or whatever the case may be. And that's demoralizing. I mean, that's really hard to deal with for a young person. I really feel for the way our journalists are treated sometimes. And it's another barrier to entry for talented folks. Why would they go into this field to get pushed around like that?
Talking about wanting to treat journalists well, you understand their plight for wanting to have a family. There was an effort to create a union.
It's ongoing. The union has been certified and we're negotiating now on a first contract. So we're right in the middle of it. I think it's going as well as can be expected. I was never opposed to a union necessarily. We're working our way through it. And being in the middle of it, I don't know how much we can really talk about, but I think it's born from a lot of these frustrations that we've spoken about today. A desire to continue to do this work by these journalists, and a hope that they can have strong careers and be fairly compensated for what they do. On my end, again, my job is to make sure we don't go out of business. And so a lot of times the tough decisions fall to me, and that's my job to make them. I don't like having to make them. I don't like having to only be able to pay a certain amount or not be able to rehire certain positions. But my overarching goal is to keep this paper going. And by the way, we can use help. If anybody out there agrees with me and hopes that the paper can be stronger, let's talk, because we can use all the help we can get.
My follow-up on that is I think the reason why people assumed that you were opposed to the union was because you guys had hired Littler Mendelsohn, which was a law firm that had, my understanding, worked with Starbucks and Amazon to prevent unionization there. Joelle Hall was quoted in your paper as saying that after subjecting your employees to 8 months of gaslighting, dilatory tactics, professional pressure, and anti-union misinformation, no one should be surprised that your employees attempting to form a union all voted yes and then subsequently left for greener pastures. Who can blame them? I don't know if you can combat any of her statement or push back at all.
I don't know, Joelle. I don't know exactly what she's talking about. I had no idea. I don't think any of that is true. It is a long process. The average first contract takes over 400 days. I don't think people realize that. It's longer than I would like it to take. The union is represented out of Seattle, and so it requires travel back and forth. It's not like we can just meet once a week. Unfortunately, things would be faster if they were local, and they're not. We hired Littler Mendelsohn. It had nothing to do with Starbucks or Amazon. There's just only a few attorneys in Anchorage that have experience in this field, and that firm happens to have an Anchorage branch. It's nothing more than that. I think any law firm that typically represents management probably gets a bad rap, but ultimately the tenor of the negotiation falls to me. And our attorney will follow my lead. I'm the client and I direct how we behave. And if you don't like the conduct, I would blame Starbucks and Amazon more than I would necessarily their attorneys. But I'm not going to speak for the employees. They can do that themselves. They certainly don't need me. But as far as I can tell, I think it's going okay. I've never been through this process before, so I'm learning. It's been fairly amicable and we're working our way through it. And we're trying to match up what everybody wants with what the realities of this business are. And that's a interesting push-pull process, and we're working our way through it. And I'm hopeful for an amicable result. I don't want to go to war with these people. Look, I got into this business to be able to enable them to continue to do the work they're doing. So I have no desire to beat them down or hammer them down on anything. I want to do the best I can by them.
If you were to make any predictions for the future of Alaska's newspapers and the ADN in particular, where do you see yourselves in a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years?
We are going to make a push here to try and build up an outside funding revenue stream. That's our next big initiative. To look at funders in Alaska. For the last 7 years, we've asked our subscribers to pay the bills. And our subscribers have stepped up in a big way. We've grown subscriptions, over 10x what they were 7 years ago. And we're really close to a point where if all of the rest of the business fell apart, God forbid, the newsroom could still be sustainable. I mean, we're on the doorstep with that. We're not far away from crossing the digital divide to a sustainable future. And so we've come to the point now we're going to go out into the community and we're going to ask for the communities to support us to get us the rest of the way there. And that's going to be a big part of our funding model going forward. And it's going to be the local Alaskan community, and it's going to be the national community as well. There's a lot of national foundations that are supporting independent journalism in small communities.
Do you know any information about Alaska Beacon? I'm curious about their funding stream.
It's a nonprofit, a national nonprofit called States Newsroom, and they put small newsrooms like the Beacon in states around the country. I'm not an expert on it. I've been told that it's fairly well funded from the left, but I've also been told that each state is pretty autonomous in the way that they can cover things. And even though that may be a funding source, that there isn't a national mandate necessarily. And I would say from my perspective, being a news junkie in Alaska, I haven't seen any of that influence in the Beacon. They've called balls and strikes and they've been fair. And I wouldn't accuse them of having any bent, but I would say that the state's newsroom writ large is considered to be funded from one side for whatever that's worth. I have no complaints about them, though. And I'm from Warm Reporters, like I said. And they've been very generous with their content for us and other outlets as well. They've really contributed to the ecosystem here, I'd say.
Last question I ask everybody is if they want to recommend a book. Before I do that, I just have to say, I can just see her name, Ayn Rand, behind you.
Oh, yes.
I don't know. Are you going to recommend The Fountainhead or?
Oh, I would. But I mentioned I was back in college and trying to answer the big questions of life. I was a really big fan of her writing and still am. But I'm reading right now a great book, a book called Boyd, about a fighter pilot named John Boyd, who I had never heard of before. And he came into the Air Force at the end of World War II and fought through Korea, and was the first fighter pilot to really take aerial tactics and quantify them through math and physics and really revolutionize the way the Air Force fights. It's an interesting guy, fascinating book. And I would also recommend, if this topic of news and information is interesting, the Yuval Harari book, Nexus, that I read, I think, last year. It's really interesting. It talks about how humans' greatest superpower is cooperation, and the way we cooperation is through exchanging information. And the way we exchange information has evolved with technology over the years, from written tablets to the printing press to then the internet and now AI. And so it's very interesting. And of course, newspapers figure big into that story of how humans cooperate through the exchange of information. And I thought it was really interesting.
So that's Nexus, a brief history of information networks from the Stone Age to AI by Yuval Noah Harari.
Yeah, he's a bit of an AI doomer. I'm an AI optimist. I don't agree with his predictions necessarily, but it's a fascinating history of how we exchange information. And it really gets you thinking about Facebook and different platforms and how information exchange plays such a central role in humankind's lives.
Got it. And your other book was Boyd, the Fighter Pilot Who Changed the Art of War by Robert Coram.
Yep.
And thanks so much for being on the show today.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully you don't have too much cleanup with some of those answers I stumbled through, but
you did
happy
great
to be here.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklog.gov or call 907-269-0123.